Welcome to another episode of Jay's Analysis. This time we will cover the rest of the Anglo-American establishment by Dr. Carroll Quigley. I must say every time, once again, we are not covering this book because Quigley is a great thinker. We're not covering this book because this is a social justice warrior attack on the Anglo-American establishment. Quigley is an apologist for this establishment, and he's writing from the Council on Foreign Relations archives. And so the works of Quigley constitute an inside look and a propagandist look into the establishment of the West and really the origins of the New World Order in the last 100 years. Now, if you heard last time, I discussed the topic of the major players and their ideology. In the last sections of the book, Quigley is going to update us and give us the into the 30s and 40s what their machinations were. In this section, he calls it the Milner Group, and that is Lord Alfred Milner, and then all of the cognate institutions around them. And so it's going to be very important because we're going to get an insight into the actual global government, how it's operated, and how it still operates today, even though it has kind of shifted out of the English sphere and then it has moved into, obviously, the American sphere. So let's look at that right now. Now, a little bit of brief review before we get into the second half. We saw in the first half, and if you haven't heard the full lectures that I did last year on the totality of Tragedy and Hope, which is, again, his 1,300-page magnum opus that details the 20th century, again, from the Council on Foreign Relations archives, go and listen to those lectures. This is really an addendum to that. So what you have is this older idea of the British Commonwealth. And the British Commonwealth, we're told at least, is supposed to be grounded in the idea of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Yes, the Masonic ideals. And I don't think that's accidental. I mean, this is really the origin of modern-day Freemasonry, comes out of England. Now, I do view Masonry as a conspiratorial organization, and that's precisely because of the way that they themselves speak of the organization. We can also see that everywhere that Masonry goes, the promotion of liberty, equality, and fraternity and, quote, democracy end up being the modus operandi in the social, governmental, societal sphere, basically. What do you get? You get the beheading of the monarchs, you get Jacobins, you get all these different revolutionary, quote-unquote, forces that try to install the ideal republic, right? The republic that's supposed to be based on reason, but eventually this becomes democracies. This is where we are in the modern world. We're being told that, that older phase of Republican revolution needs to give way to democracy, right? So-called egalitarianism, equalitarianism. Now, all of these ideas, again, are really out of the philosophical schools of the Enlightenment and then the post-Enlightenment period, which are grounded in various ideas of a change in anthropology from the ancient and medieval world, many subjects that we've detailed countless times. But it's also important to understand that it's more of an oligarchy, and ironically, even Plato described the fact that democracy is an oligarchic institution, in that it's really big families and moneyed oligarchs that are always behind democracy, because democracy isn't really about the people. It's about the most manipulative, controlling the masses through base desire type philosophy imaginable. And that's really what we're looking at here. And so what we get with this group in the central area of the British Imperium is the attempt to manage all of their colonies at the turn of the century, the 1890s into 1900, through various models and plans. And what they found was that the best model would be this kind of so-called democratic model, right? We're going to use democracy in the various colonies and let the people think that they have democracy, quote unquote. Meanwhile, it's all going to be run by a shadow banking institution, and that shadow banking institution is housed in the city of London. It is the Lord Rothschild is one of the key founders of this organization, and it's called the Secret Society of the Elect. And this is what Cecil Rhodes, the great diamond magnate of South Africa, this was his idea, was working in tandem with Nathan Rothschild, was the idea of creating a liberal imperium, the idea of a commonwealth of nations based on the British Commonwealth idea for the whole world. And as a result, various areas of the globe, eventually they came to the conclusion, would have to be split up into zones, global zones. And this roughly corresponds over time to really continental unions or federations. And so this is the group that we're talking about here, this Society of the Elect, that is behind the Royal Institute for International Affairs, the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the U.S. version of that, Chatham House, which is one of their central ideological publication / propaganda outlets. It's the Royal Society, which goes back even further than the Royal Institute for International Affairs. It's the lodges of Masonry, which interestingly Quigley leaves out. That has no place in his treatment. I mean, as a historian, you're going to treat of the 20th century, and you're not going to talk about a movement that is in pretty much every country in the world. I mean, give me a break. And I mean, there are scholarly books on this very fact: Builders of Empire, Freemasonry and British Imperialism, 1717 to 1927. And it was an expensive book. I got this because it's a very important aspect that Quigley just leaves out. It plays no place in his supposed historical treatment. But remember, what did we see last time? Well, we saw that this group, again, that it's not solely royalty. The king is really kind of being told in many ways what to do by this inner group. So we're not really talking about the king and the queen or whoever. We're talking about an inner group of thinkers, what we might call the brains, and then the financiers. And this would be the big money families and industrialists. And then you have the revolving door phenomena, where these people are then put into the various government positions, and then they rotate out of that into the many private foundation, think tank, educational institutions, and so forth. They really play these key roles because they're situated at important nodes or places in society, right? So this is literally how Quigley describes it. Again, Quigley, mainline historian, not a conspiracy theorist. Quigley very much an apologist for this group, not an opponent, a sincere duped believer, an idiot, basically. And, it's hard to tell exactly to what degree Quigley is just a retard or to what degree he is nefarious. I think it's a lot easier case to make that he just so blatantly contradicts himself so many times that I think he really believes this stuff, which just makes him all the more ridiculous. He's also a shitty writer. The writing is terrible. It's the most boring, technical, uninteresting writing that you could ever torture yourself with. So you ought to be thankful that I am here doing this for you. I mean, I don't understand these people that get so mad at me for making these videos and talking about this stuff, and all these hateful comments and just vile, disgusting comments that I get at times. And I mean, who else is doing this for you? Who else is doing this? I mean, there are a couple other sites that do this stuff. I'm not knocking them, but I'm saying nobody else is reading 1,300-page books and summarizing them for you, and then going and reading the extra 300-page addendum and summarizing it for you. So I'm doing a great service for you here. I'm helping you, and it seems like the more popular that the site gets, the more attention and traction that the site gets and my work gets. The more opposition. Obviously, I understand that. That's natural. I'm not worried about that. I'm not scared. It's just ludicrous to me that that so many people are so petty. I mean, all that's doing is hurting you. You're not hurting me. You're not stopping me and what I'm doing. In fact, I'm stepping up my game. I'm going to be knocking out more of these globalist books on a regular basis than I have been, precisely because the first season of the television show is finished. So I have a lot more time now to focus on this stuff, which I think is the real crucial stuff. I love Hollywood. I love decoding film. but it's not the most important thing out there, right? I mean, this kind of stuff is really understanding our world, and it's the stuff that matters. Now, there's all these people in these different alt media circles out there, and they're all into these movements, and they're all hyped up, and they're radicalized. And I'm not saying everybody's wrong in these various views, but I mean, have any of you read this stuff? Do you know this stuff? Do you know what you're talking about? Do you understand how the 20th century got here? Before you go off railing on all these things, and before you bitch about me and what I talk about, have you looked at these things? Have you? I have, and the world is more complex than we would like to make it. I mean, in certain ways, it's more simple, right? It's not that complex. We are dealing with oligarchs that are running things. And that's pretty simple, but at the same time, there's a lot of complexity in the onion rings and the deceptions and the layers and the ways that they control things. But what we're going to see, as we said before, is that this book is really another window into one angle of that pyramid, right? This is the real pyramid that controls and runs most of the world. The Atlantis power block of the U.S., the U.K., Israel. This is the Western power block, and they're characterized as Atlanticists precisely because the Atlantic Ocean has nothing to do with Atlantis, and because it's the sea power. The sea power represents monetarism, trade, right? This is what the sea is about. The land power, Russia, right? Eurasia. This represents stability, stasis, right, as opposed to the flux of the waves of the ocean, of the maritime powers and their Imperium. So you have two kind of rival worldviews inherently based just solely upon the geography. And this goes back to Mackinder, one of the Royal Society strategists. This goes back to many of the 20th century's geopolitical strategists, and it's the continuation of most geopolitical writers and thinkers today, right? Alexander Dugin speaks this way still. We saw Brzezinski speaking this way. Many writers still use these kinds of categories to describe the layout of the world. But as we said, the secret society of Rhodes is modeled on Jesuitism and Roman Catholicism. And Rhodes functions as a kind of pope, I guess, with Lord Rothschild in this situation. And I've noted here for you how this situation began. And it began with the who Quigley calls the junta of Stead, Brett, and Milner. And of course, Lord Rothschild is up there. He mentions that later. And then you have these other circle of initiates, Cardinal Manning, interestingly, Lord Balfour, right? So this is what we're looking at early on. This is like the 1890s period when this was getting started, when Rhodes had this initial idea. And then as we move into the 20th century, the 19-teens, 20s, 30s, this is when they had really established, especially after World War I, all of the organs and infiltrators into the various aspects of society in order to influence society in their direction. So they were behind the League of Nations. They were behind eventually the G8, the G20, the G30, these kinds of groupings. They were behind the operations of Oxford, All Souls, many seats at Cambridge. And what this did was this allowed them to control who would go into the positions of power and influence in society. They didn't care about controlling every single thing. Really, they only worried about the important roles or seats of power and influence and controlling them. Just certain ones, right? And then certain magazines, the Times, eventually different media organizations. Eventually, they would control the BBC, the Ministry of Information. This group would eventually rule from a shadow perspective behind this facade of all these government people. And that's the model of the world that we have today, is these shadow financiers, these shadow corporate entities that roll behind this facade of the so-called elected officials, and by winning people over to this ideology, which, interesting, it's very important. It's based on propaganda. When we think about something like Foreign Affairs magazine, or when we think about the Round Table magazine, we might think, oh, these are great works that are going to really give us philosophical depth and insight into. No, they're actually, as Quigley says, the highest levels of propaganda. So, for example, the Rhodes Scholarships that were offered to recruit the best and the brightest into this conspiracy, they were offered on the basis of propagandizing people. So it had really nothing to do with solely controlling everybody's perception. They only wanted to control certain people's perceptions, and then that would filter down into the rest of society. That's not very democratic, is it? I thought that they're always talking in glowing terms of democracy. Well, that's not democratic, is it? That's because they're not Democrats. They don't really believe in democracy, despite their endless spew, this Niagara Falls of vomit of democracy, that they just infinite vomit of democracy, right? Liberty, equality, fraternity, liberty, equality, fraternity, vomit. It's nonstop until the whole society just swims in it, and it's like, oh yeah, democracy. Well, yeah, we believe that. Meanwhile, this place is a monarchy, and it's ruled by the most oligarchic secret society that the world has ever seen up to this point. And they've convinced the masses that they have democracy. Now, how do they do that? Well, at this time, they were convincing people through baloney propaganda about the British Empire being the civilizing force in the world, and we have to really worry about Asiatic despotism, right? Germany and its Nazis, Japan and its empire, China, its Imperium, Russia and the Tsar. Bad guys, all the bad guys. The only good guys in the whole world are the Anglo-American pragmatics, and their alignment, I guess you could say, with the eventual banking empires of Europe. That's not just Rothschilds and Jewish banking. That's also Catholic banking, Protestant banking, and Jewish banking, as Quigley points out. All of them in the West become aligned eventually. Why? Because their god is Mammon. If you're a banker, what system do you want in place globally? You want free trade. You want no tariffs. You want the ability for the nations to accept your currency, right? You control that currency and its issuance. All of these things is exactly what they did. And this is why Spengler is right and perceptive to call the West in its modern phase Homo economic. It's economic man who worships economy. Everything is viewed in terms of economics. And no longer is it viewed in terms of worldview, philosophy, theology, meaning. It's economic units of production, energy, and movable commodities. The sea power. The relativistic, nihilistic, sodomite sea power. So the Atlanticist goals is what we're going to talk about as we get into the rest of this video. But I'm going to stop it here just because this is really the introduction, the overall talk for the rest of the book. If you want to hear more, you can subscribe at Jay's Analysis for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year. You can also get a copy of my book, signed, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, over 100 5-star reviews in 9 months, and now a TV show on Gaia. You can subscribe to the TV show. The first episode has now appeared. They will appear weekly every Monday. The first episode is the Matrix Trilogy, where we dive into some pretty heavy philosophy and analyze the film from a lot of different angles, Jay Widener and I. And you can subscribe at Gaia for that. But as I said, this talk will continue at my website for subscribers. Thanks for watching. Welcome, friends, to the second installment of the Anglo-American Establishment by Carroll Quigley. And we covered the first half in the first talk, and I wanted to get to this sooner, but I had some interviews and work come up that I had to get done first. So let's get into this. Recapping, we saw that the banksters are in the background of this shadow roundtable group, and that they took the idea of the liberal commonwealth, the liberal world order, would be based on this idea of eternal vigilance and liberty fighting despotism, tyranny, and theocracy. So anything related to the idea of God ruling, this is labeled theocracy. Anything to do with hierarchy, this is all undemocratic, we're told. This is page 133. So, and the ideologues here cast all of history as this eternal dialectical battle between liberty and tyranny. So we have the French Revolutionary Masonic philosophy again being at the core of this, and we noted how Quigley has no place for Masonry or revolutionary thought in his analyses. However, we know that from many of the other thinkers coming out of the British Anglo schools, such as Bertrand Russell and the Fabians and so forth, we know that their philosophy of pragmatism and liberalism is the same as Masonry. That's why many of the Thomas Reid, many of the Enlightenment philosophers also share this Masonic ideal, the same Masonic ideals that would try to be implemented by force by the Jacobins in the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. So we had some interesting statements too, that the goal of the society was to infiltrate at all levels in the key institutions of influence and power. They didn't care about total control of everything, just those key nodes, those key spots: media, education, and religion. And we talked about how both Catholics and Anglicans were recruited into this Anglo-American establishment order. And yes, it includes Zionism too, but the reason that it's not focused on Zionism is that it's the British Empire that is the context and power behind setting up Zionism, or the modern state of Israel. Now, there's a whole chapter that Quigley has on that that's pretty fascinating, that I think is a more realistic perspective than these simplistic boil downs of, oh, the whole world is Jew versus non-Jew. That's not reality. In fact, after the British set up the partition of the Jews in the Palestinian state, Quigley says they wanted it that way, to remain that way, as a never-ending kind of conflict. So that's actually organized by the Roundtable Group. And I want to stress too that even back then, in the teens, 20s, and 30s, they had control of the major organs of publications in England. So they ran the Times, the Economist, the Spectator. They had Foreign Affairs, Roundtable Magazine, etc., and the BBC. And they ran the Ministry of Information during the war times, which is the intelligence apparatics. So their main interest, though, according to Chapter 8, was foreign policy, and that was so that they could get democracy set up across the world. So the old canard of human rights violations as the means by which we're going to police the world, that is the basis for the whole 20th century's Atlanticist establishment. It's not something new with the Pentagon. It goes back to the Royal Society guys saying, I doubt that if Germany comes to power, we will ever have a chance of getting peaceful democracy set up in Germany. That's one of the Roundtable guys named John Dove. And so you just have endless kind of statements like that. British imperialism is the only civilized order in the world, they said. And if we allow anything else to come to power, we will be back in barbarism. So, the Masonic egalitarian society is the only civilized society. And what do you have now with this society? Well, you've got your trannies and your social justice warriors and your 60 genders and your abortion and all this degeneracy. That's the only civilized order there is. So, Commonwealth, as we said, was the origin. The goals, as are stated here clearly on page 150, the goals were always a new world order. The Round Table Group always was interested in setting up a new world order, and it would be done through all of these networks that we've described. That new world order would be the extension, expansion, and rebranding of the British, quote, Commonwealth. And when questions of loyalty to country came up, to fellow men and kin, the English idea of liberty was assimilated much more completely than the idea of loyalty. So generic liberty, monetarism, money power is more important than loyalty to your people. Of course, this is the very idea of everything post Adam Smith in terms of economics, and David Ricardo and John Locke and all of the left economists, is that the orders of society become inverse. There's no longer a spiritual that's the primacy. Man's ordering of life and desires function mainly around materialism and monetarism. And so the greatest and highest senses of liberty and freedom really amount to having your own wealth and being able to exact usury. So under the guise of liberty, you're back into total slavery. And that's why every nation on the planet, after all this libertarian liberal order, why is it that all the nations are stuck back in the Federal Reserve style system of usury debt-based economics? So as he covers many times in Tragedy and Hope, Quigley talks about the Institute for Pacific Relations being set up. This was kind of the early Rockefeller analog to the Round Table Group's Council on Foreign Relations. Also, this IPR, CFR, they're all interconnected. The IPR was mainly concerned with the Pacific and Asia, right? And they were having meetings in Kyoto in 1929. The plan was originated by the British Empire and members of the Institute for Pacific Relations at the Kyoto meeting in 1929. Members of the Great Britain consisted of Lord Cecil, etc., 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 Toynbee, all the usual suspects. This committee was made final in the arrangement of Chatham House. So in other words, even prior to World War II, there were meetings in Japan about what was going to happen and how this region of the globe needed to be organized. Then we get into the section on Zionism and Balfour, and that's where we have Quigley explaining that to the minds of the Royal Society, Balfour, Milner, they didn't care either way about Arabs or Jews. In fact, the whole point was to try to manipulate and use both sides of that dialectic. And he says that many times, and many of them, they didn't care about Judaism, they didn't care about Zionism. They were interested in a hotspot in the Middle East that could be an outpost for the British Empire, the Jewish state. They thought they could have a better chance at that with Jews and Zionism than if they kept it as a, quote, Arab state. So it really has nothing to do with, from the Royal Society perspective, of some committed ideology of Zionism. And this is where a lot of people just go crazy off the boards with this stuff. They don't actually read the historians who talk about it. Now, again, so if you're the British Imperial controllers and organizers, I mean, there's a huge population of Arabs in the world, and the British Empire has worked with, trained, funded so many radical Arabs, radicalized them across the globe. Now, why would they only want to side with Jews or Zionism? They don't. They want to control both sides of the conflict. And it's the same thing that you see the inheritors of the British Empire, the American system doing nowadays. It gives money to Egypt as well as to Israel, right? That's the top two places, along with, I think, Colombia, that U.S. money goes every year. They told the king what they wanted done. Quigley says on page 179, so we don't get the impression that the king was really running this stuff. So this is not a monarchy per se. It's a monarchy and a parliament that are run from behind the scenes by this special group. And he mentions the inquiry, which is the academics that would become the origins of the CIA and the OSS in the West. That's also, as we said many times, mentioned by Servando Gonzalez in his book, that the origins of the modern CIA comes out of the inquiry. And this is the groups of academics prior to the establishment of the OSS in the circles of J.P. Morgan and Company. And that's backed up by Quigley on page 183. Another interesting insight is the organization of the institution. So you have the Royal Institute of International Affairs is the external group of academics and all these kinds of people. And there's about 2,500 of them. And then in the inner core, you have the Milner group, which is about 100 people, the inner party. And then you have the Society of the Elect on the inner core of them, which is 12 people, like some evil 12 apostles or something. And then the core there of 3. So from 3 to 12 to 100 to 2,500. And so this is kind of, the turn of the century at least, this is the real pyramid, the real Illuminati pyramid. And it's these people, because they're the ones who structure the world. They're the ones who set up the global zones, so-called. They're the ones that set up all the conferences that lead to the League of Nations. They set up the League of Nations. They organized the G8, the G20, the G30. And it's this group. It's the Milner group. They're running stuff at this time. They're also intimately connected on pages 188, 189 with the Rockefellers in the West. The J.P. Morgan and Rockefellers are their analog and compatriots in the U.S., especially the New England establishment, the Yale, Columbia crowd, right? The Harvard crowd. And so the Rockefellers sent their man Jerome Green to be the representative at the Chatham House Royal Society meetings. Similarly, in the U.S., you have the CFR being set up based on the Round Table Chatham House structures. So the banks are also in the background on page 190, funding the CFR and Chatham House. Rockefeller gave thousands of dollars. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which would later become BP, donated money. The Bank of England put money into this Royal Society. The Barclays Bank, Baring Brothers, British American Tobacco, Central Mining Investment, Erlingers, Ford Motor, Imperial Chemicals, Lazard Brothers, Lloyd's Bank, Rothschild and Sons, Stern Brothers, Midland Bank. And so what you see is that this is not just Jews. This is like all across the board. It's the establishment. It's the establishment of New York and of London. And it's about global control, and it's not really about ideologies here. I mean, they do have a propagandist ideology that they promote of freedom and liberty and all this baloney. But it's really about control, and that's kind of Orwell's point in 1984, because he's talking about this group, right? The inner party, the outer party. It's these people he's talking about. Carnegie Endowment is involved. France is equally a partner in all this. with the British power structure. Alan Dulles comes up, interestingly. Obviously, he's relevant in terms of CIA. The CIA, this is the group that set up the OSS and the CIA, by the way. So, again, we're not talking about fighting commies here. This is the structure that's supra-commie, that they're above the commies. They tout the fact in page 201 that they almost always supported true liberalism, true leftism in the House of Lords and through the Cecil family. That was, of course, to wreck society, to create a easily managed population. And I like the fact, too, that on page 204 and 205, they treat democracy like a religion. Yeah, exactly, it is. It's always that way because it's not based in reality. All the egalitarian assumptions of democracy and so forth. It really requires a kind of religious commitment, and that's what a lot of the helpers and the people, in the academic sphere who had been propagandized properly really thought that they were part of some organization that's hell-bent on healing the world and fixing it. And of course, obviously they're not. I mean, none of these people are so foolish or stupid as to believe that democracy is real. It's a weapon. But of course, it's really only the inner party and the higher levels of the inner party that is fully conscious of that. You have a lot of the outer party and the Association of Helpers and people on the Royal Society, round tables and so forth who really believe that democracy is a real thing, and that once we set up voting booths in all of the Asiatic countries, freedom will be there. We will have helped them. They talk about minority rights, always promoting minority rights, page 218. So that's not something that began with Saul Alinsky or any of these kind of modern leftists. They were talking about this as a strategy, page 218, all the way back in the teens and 20s. They had a faith in federation, self-responsibility, and minority rights. Oh yeah, right. And this is in the section, the chapter where he's talking about the Milner Group dealing with Gandhi and the how India would transition out of being a colonial state into an independent state. Yeah, right. Give me a break. Even anybody believes that, you might as well just turn this off, because the Milner Group was not interested in genuinely giving India independence. They wanted to rule it again from the background. So there's a big breakdown where he says on page 234 that all the way into the 40s, the Milner Group completely controlled India, 100%. And then he even says that they were fine with, on page 225, they were fine with dismantling the older idea of the British Empire. Why is that? Well, because in many chapters, many sections, he points out that these people are not committed to a certain group of people. They're internationalists. Therefore, they're not bound by the ideas of patriotism or, I'm not my brother's keeper. They are monetarists. They're international bankers. They're interested in control, and they're not interested in the idea that they have any duties to other people. This is kind of radical Ayn Rand style philosophy. Hence, they're internationalists. And they really had sway with the king, he says again, page 229. This just keeps coming up. They kind of just tell the king, what to do and what's going to happen. He points out that, in the Tragedy and Hope section, he talked a lot about the Cliveden set. Cliveden set is the Milner Group. He says it in this book. It's all the same people. It's not just different names for the same upper hand and controlling force. They were behind Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Quigley thinks that they were genuinely fighting the Illuminists, and yes, he brings up the actual Illuminati: Trotsky, Bela Kun, Kurt Eisner, Spartacus. This is the actual Illuminati, but Quigley seems to think that they really feared Bolshevism and communism coming to all the countries, and so therefore the Milner Group was genuinely anti-communist or something like that. I don't buy that. I mean, a lot of these same people that he mentions, these bankers, were involved in funding Bolshevism. So I don't buy that. I think Quigley, even as a CFR archive guy, probably wasn't in on all the secrets. So he may not have known that these are the people that also funded Bolshevism, or maybe he did know and he's covering it up. I don't know. But he mentions that the bankers behind the Dawes Plan and all the reparations plans. We covered that in several hours of lectures in Tragedy and Hope. You can go watch those if you haven't seen them. That was all to bankrupt Germany and put their descendants into perpetual debt to bankers. They decided that for a while they were interested in socialism for England, but then he says that they just decided around 1930s to forget the idealistic socialism. We'll get more of our plans through with monopoly capitalism. So that's what they went with. But he mentions that many of the Milner Group had these kind of socialistic ideas. Then it goes on to discuss the League of Nations and how it and why it failed. It failed because it was not a super state. It failed because it had no teeth and it was a debating society. The Milner Group eventually became disillusioned with the League of Nations, which they had created, and decided basically that they needed to shut that thing down and reboot it. And that's when you get World War II and the United Nations, which is the reboot. But it's still probably not everything that they want it to be, but it is really the initial steps towards the global government that were being propagandized and phased into. So they started in the 1920s, the CFR, the IPR, and J.P. Morgan and the Rockefellers with propagandizing America and the American public. This is all covered in Tragedy and Hope. This is the America First movement, eventually. This is the anti-interventionist stances, the isolationism and all that. They really wanted to shift America's opinion out of that older view and back into foreign adventurism and back into supporting whatever the British Empire wanted to do. And then he gets into what we said about Tragedy and Hope, 265 to 277, that the key, the reason for the appeasement of Hitler, the reason for the promoting and trying to lure Hitler into doing these things to become an aggressor, was because they wanted to provoke wars that would weaken their two rivals, Germany and Russia. And so those wars, World War I, World War II, and Cold War, were precisely the goals that began back in World War I, probably provoked by British intelligence with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by the Black Hand, probably some British intelligence thing. There's reason to believe that. I don't have any proof. I'm not 100% positive, but it's probably a false flag to provoke World War I. You have the Lusitania as well, and we know that was a false flag, admittedly. And so that got them the League of Nations and their permanent roundtable. The League of Nations is a roundtable. It's a permanent roundtable, or that's what they envisioned initially. But it doesn't work, and so as we said, they decided more war, World War I, World War II. This weakens Russia and Germany. Cold War weakens Russia. Russia's dismantled in the 90s. And so that's the key here is the same group, same people, same establishment. All those people from Harvard, that's who dismantled Russia in the 90s after all of this PSYOPs and Soviet Cold War stuff. Page 282, they wanted back in the 30s, they planned all of the global zones and continental unions that they wanted to set up in the 30s. In the 20s, in the 30s at least, no, 20s, the New York Times was propaganda for the Council on Foreign Relations in the 1920s. There you go. And Carnegie and Rockefeller were putting money into that. Again, the New York Times was propaganda for the CFR and Carnegie and Rockefeller in the 20s. So there's your fake news. This is interesting. Coudenhove-Kalergi. I thought that was a conspiracy theory. Well, Quigley says on page 284 that he gave his presentation to the round table. Count Coudenhove-Kalergi gave his arguments for the creation of the European Union, and we all know what the Kalergi plan is, right? Destroy this group of nations, Europe, with mass immigration. Destroy the existing populations with mass immigration. Coudenhove-Kalergi plan presented in 1939. Well, looks to me like that's what they've done. So not a conspiracy theory. That's Quigley admits it. Page 284. Also, as we said, many of these Milner Group were into Christian Science. They had bought into this goofy cult. I don't know whether they thought it was a way to just kind of create a new religion, maybe new agey religion to go along with the League of Nations and UN, or maybe really many of them really believe this stupid cult. It's hard to know. This was interesting. I did not know this. If you take philosophy in college, you will read Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah Berlin is he's kind of like Karl Popper and kind of like a famous liberal, modern liberal philosopher on the state and so forth. Isaiah Berlin was recruited into the Milner Group. Interesting. 305. So here you have academics, right, in the intercoterie of the New World, the real New World Order, the real Illuminati here. What else? Other university. This should come as no surprise with all that we've read on the MK Ultra. This actually just confirms it that McGill University and Yale were directly connected to the Milner Groups. Page 2. Milner Group and Royal Society. Page 306. Ministry of Information and BBC will run by this group. We already know that. No surprise there. London School of Economics. I mean, all the stuff that we've heard a million times over. This really just confirms it all. And then this amazing quote at the end of the book that I don't know if did Quigley think that this thing had really failed, or he seems to be a true believer, I guess, in the liberal world order, and he's like, what began by Toynbee, Milner, and Rothschild in 1875 slowly ground its way to a finish of bitterness and ashes into the 20th century with its world wars. Page 310. So does that mean that the liberal world order was a giant failure, or what do you mean, Carroll? I mean, you gave us the world, Bill and Hillary, right? You're their mentor. Thank you for more of your liberal world order. Hasn't it been great? Now, the appendix is interesting because I want to show you, this is the real Illuminati. This is the real, who's up there at the turn of the century at least. Cecil Rhodes, Baron Rothschild, Alfred Milner. That's the Society of the Elect. This is not a conspiracy book. Remember that. This is not a conspiracy book. This is the CFR guy writing a history of the West and its leaders. Then, as we say, the Association of Helpers, the Inner Circle, and the Outer Circle. Exactly what Orwell said. And then we remember from there, on the outside, is the 2,500 Royal Society members. So a lot of interest, some little gems in the footnotes too, at the back in notes. He says that many biographies of Milner conceal more than they reveal. It's an interesting claim. I guess Quigley would know. All of the Milner group and the RIIA were fiercely anti-German for the most part. So that we know that their motivations were not peace and democracy, but the destruction of Germany and Russia. Page 327, it was all bankers in the background. We already knew that. The group is supposed to be rabidly anti-Bolshevik, page 333, but as we said, don't really think that's true, especially given the fact that Bolsheviks were intimately connected to Grand Orient Masonry, and Quigley has no place for Masonry in any of this discussion. So what is the underlying philosophy, though, of the Milner Group? Liberty, equality, fraternity, and democracy. And that is moneyed oligarchy, right? Masonic philosophy. So the Masonic world order is where we live now, right? This is the modern age. And, is it better, really? What did it give us? Well, maybe you could argue that we've gotten iPhones and TVs out of this, but what has that really advanced humanity? iPhones and TVs. And, by the way, we don't know what would have happened if there had not been a Masonic world revolution. The world might be a better place. We might have better science. Who knows? We'll never know because of the course that history did take, especially in the West. But it's a false assumption that many people have, where they kind of have this thing where they'll be like, oh, well, because it went the way that it did, and now that we have technology, that was the best of all possible options, right? You don't know that. You don't know what would have happened had things gone a different way. So it's just a kind of arrogant presumption to assume that because we had the Masonic revolutions and they gave us iPhones and TVs, that we wouldn't have had iPhones and TVs in any other timeline of history, right? Back to the Future timelines or something. But so that's what we have with Quigley. And thank you for watching both installments. I think it's accurate. This is a really key book, like Tragedy and Hope. It really zeroes in on the power elite during this period. Some people wrote comments and said, this is not the real power elite. There's another shadow group behind them. I mean, maybe, but do you have evidence of that, or are you just saying it? I mean, I think the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and the Morgans and Cecil Rhodes and these characters who've set up the world as it is, we openly know they did it. If there's some shadowy group even shadowier than them, then we need some kind of evidence to see that. I don't see why it's not just these people. I mean, these people are the ones that are out there putting this world together in the deformed fashion that it now takes on. So there you have it. And what can you say? I mean, it's a mainline book that really vindicates the idea of how our world is structured. And what else can you say? I mean, if people out there are not taking this in and really letting this soak in, then you're never going to be able to interpret the world correctly. You're always going to be caught off into some little dialectical manipulated movement. But I think that if we can really understand the power elite from their perspective in books like this, we're much better off, and we're not going to be duped. So thank you for watching.